They told the neighbors it was a sickness. That's why the shutters stayed closed. That's why no one had seen the Rutherford children in weeks. But on a freezing January night in 1765, a single scream ripped through Benefit Street, so sharp, so blood-curdling, that half the town came running with lanterns. When the constables forced the front door open, the house was silent again. Inside, the air was thick with a smell they would later struggle to describe. Not rot, not smoke. Something closer to burnt sugar, cloying, sweet enough to make men gag. And then they heard it. A sound no one ever forgot. Children, singing, not playfully, not happily. Their voices were slow, steady, almost chanting, in a language no one in Providence had ever heard. The sound was coming from the basement. When the constables descended the stairs, lanterns shaking in their hands, they found two tiny bodies lying side by side on the dirt floor, pale, frail, too still. But the singing didn't stop. It kept going, even though the mouths of those children never moved, and on the walls all around them, scratched into the stone, were strange symbols glowing faintly in the light, shapes no one could recognize, as though they had been burned there by fire that never went out. The men fled the house that night. Some swore they heard little footsteps following them all the way up the stairs. The official record says nothing more than incident resolved. The case was buried in Boston's archives and sealed for 100 years. But the house could not be sealed, and every family who tried to live there since has reported the same thing. The sound of children singing under the floorboards, the smell of oil lamps burning where no lamps exist, and the cold, unmistakable feeling of a small hand wrapping around their ankle in the dark. This is not a ghost story. This is a confession, because what Ezra Rutherford was doing in that basement wasn't murder. It was an experiment. And once you learn what he was trying to create, you'll never look at children or prayer the same way again. To understand what happened in that basement, you need to understand Ezra Rutherford. By day, he was one of Providence's most respected men, a deacon, a merchant, a father of 6. The kind of man who sat in the front pew every Sunday nodding solemnly as the minister spoke. But behind closed doors, Ezra was obsessed with a single question. What does it take to make a soul pure? He read every sermon, every tract, every private letter he could get from Boston preachers and even European mystics. He filled journals with theories that sin was a disease, that it could be burned out of a person like sickness from the blood. And then he started looking at his own children. They were young, innocent, but to Ezra, they were unfinished experiments. He wrote that children were the soft clay of the Lord's hand, and he believed that if he could keep them untouched by the outside world, uncorrupted by other children, by books, even by play, he could raise the first truly sinless generation. At first, the neighbors noticed nothing strange. The Rutherford children still came to church, still smiled politely when spoken to. But little by little, Ezra withdrew them. No more playtime in the yard, no more trips to the schoolhouse. Their windows were shuttered, their voices no longer heard in the street, and Ezra's journals grew darker. He began recording their failings, a tantrum, a lie, even a laugh at the wrong moment, as if they were symptoms of disease. He punished them with silence, with days locked in the cellar, with long nights of prayer until their knees bled. One entry, just weeks before that final January night, reads, 3 still defiant, 2 softened by fasting. The littlest one, nearly ready. It wasn't enough for him to raise good children. Ezra wanted to make perfect ones, and by the end, perfection meant something horrifying. Isolation, fasting, endless prayer, until the children stopped speaking to anyone but him, until they began to sing on their own, songs Ezra never taught them, in words he didn't understand. That was when he stopped writing in his journal and started carving symbols into the basement walls. By the time that final night came, the Rutherford house was a tomb. The shutters had been nailed shut for weeks. No one had seen the children outside. The snow around the house was untouched, no footprints leading in or out. But neighbors swore they could hear faint singing drifting through the chimney smoke at night. Not hymns, something slower, older. Inside, Ezra had transformed the cellar into what he called the Chapel of Cleansing. The walls were marked with symbols carved so deep his hands were raw. Animal fat burned in iron lamps, filling the air with that cloying, sweet smoke. The children knelt in a circle on the dirt floor, their eyes half closed, lips moving in a language no one in Providence could have taught them. Ezra knelt with them, gaunt from fasting, his face hollow but shining with zeal. His last surviving journal page was found later, half-burned, lying near the hearth. It reads like a prayer and a warning all at once. The light is nearly here. The others will not understand. They will call it murder, but I am giving these children to God before the world can soil them. The door must be barred tonight. The work must be finished. No one knows what happened in those last hours, but neighbors would later testify that they heard a woman screaming, but not words, just a single terrible sound that cut through the winter air. Some believed it was Ezra's wife, finally realizing what her husband was about to do. Others whispered it was one of the children breaking from their trance just before it was too late. When the constables finally forced their way in, they found no sign of Ezra. No body, no footprints leading away from the house, only those two tiny forms on the cellar floor, lying as though placed there gently, and the walls scorched with patterns that seemed to shimmer even after the lamps were extinguished. And in the center of the room, a single iron key, still warm to the touch. By dawn, the house had drawn a crowd. Half the town stood outside, whispering prayers, clutching rosaries, staring at the dark windows as if expecting Ezra to appear. But he never did. The constables carried the two small bodies out wrapped in linen and loaded them onto a cart bound for the churchyard. No one spoke as the wheels crunched over the frozen ground. What happened next was stranger still. The town council met in secret that same afternoon. They didn't call in the minister. They didn't hold a public inquest. Instead, they sent the sheriff's report, along with Ezra's journals and the key, to Boston under armed guard. Officially, they wrote only that the Rutherford family had succumbed to a sickness of the mind. No funeral bells were rung, no service was held, and yet no one would enter the house. Neighbors swore they heard movement inside at night, soft, shuffling footsteps, as if the children were still walking in circles. The windows, though nailed shut, sometimes glowed with a faint orange light, as though those lamps were still burning. When the town finally forced a new family to move in, a young couple from Connecticut, they lasted less than a month. The husband returned one morning to find his wife kneeling in the cellar, humming to herself, her nails worn bloody from scratching the walls. She didn't recognize him. By the time help arrived, she was dead. A piece of iron from the stove driven through her chest as if she had knelt and done it herself. The council sealed the house after that, boarding the doors and windows, posting warnings to keep strangers away, but nothing could keep out the sound. Travelers wrote about hearing faint children's voices drifting from the cellar when they passed on snowy nights. Sailors docked in Providence claimed they saw smoke rising from the chimney even though no one had lived there in years. And those who dared to look through the cracks in the shutters swore they saw something worse. A figure standing at the bottom of the cellar stairs, too tall to be a child, too still to be alive. And though no one had seen Ezra Rutherford since that night, some said the figure was smiling. Within a generation, the Rutherford house wasn't just a scandal. It was a dare. Sailors, farmhands, even ministers would whisper about it in taverns. They'd bet coin to see who could last a night inside. Most never made it past midnight. The bravest reported the same things, the faint smell of lamp oil, though the cellar was bare, tiny footprints in the dust that weren't there when they entered, and the sound, that slow, awful singing, always coming from the far corner of the basement, where the dirt looked just a little too freshly turned. One night in 1792, a group of 5 young men tried it together. They brought candles, rum, and a Bible, convinced they could laugh off the curse. By dawn, only 4 of them came out. The 5th was found kneeling in the cellar, his hands pressed flat against the dirt, whispering in a language none of them knew. His hair had gone white overnight. He never spoke again. That incident turned the house into something darker, not just a place of fear, but a place of power. People began leaving offerings at the doorstep. Coins, milk, locks of hair. Not out of reverence, but out of desperation. Crops had failed 3 years in a row. Fevers had swept through the town. Every time something bad happened, the whispers grew louder. Ezra is still here. He's still waiting. He's still trying to finish what he started. And when children began disappearing, first a toddler from a nearby farm, then 2 Broughty, hers walking home from the mill, every grieving parent found themselves staring at that shuttered house, wondering if the seller had taken them. The council tried to have the building torn down. Twice carpenters were hired. Twice they refused to touch the place after hearing footsteps on the stairs when no one was below. One man went missing entirely, his tools left scattered in the yard. By the early 1800s, the house had earned its name, the Singing Cellar, and it became a warning mothers told their children: disobey, wander too far from home, and Ezra Rutherford will take you below and teach you to sing. By the mid-1800s, the Singing Cellar had become infamous far beyond Providence. Travelers wrote about it in their journals. Spiritualists held seances in its shadow. Even Harvard scholars came to debunk the stories, armed with lanterns and notebooks. In 1843, a professor of natural philosophy, Jonathan Hale, spent 3 nights in the house with 2 assistants. He went in mocking the legend. He came out silent. When he finally published his findings in a Boston pamphlet, they shocked everyone, not because they explained the haunting, but because they refused to. Hale wrote that on the 2nd night, he and his assistants heard footsteps pacing the floor above them, even though the front door was locked from the inside. They found handprints in the dust on the cellar walls, small and perfect, as though made by children, but fresh enough to smear when touched. And worst of all, on the final night, Hale claimed to have heard a man's voice praying softly in the dark, not pleading for salvation, but giving thanks. When he lit his lantern, the cellar was empty. The most disturbing part of Hale's report wasn't what he heard, it was what he found. Near the back wall, half buried in dirt, was a 2nd iron key, identical to the one recovered the night the constable first entered the house. But this one was warm too, as though it had just been held. Hale left Providence the next morning. He never returned. And the pamphlet ended with a single chilling line: "Whatever Ezra Rutherford began in this house has not yet ended." Instead of calming the public, Hale's report reignited the legend. Pilgrims from across New England began sneaking into the house, desperate to hear the voices for themselves. And those who stayed long enough claimed something new, that the singing had changed. It was no longer just children. It was deeper now, like a man's voice had joined in. By the 1870s, the Rutherford house had become a dark attraction. Providence was growing into an industrial city now, and Benefit Street was lined with gas lamps, carriages, and the new money of factory owners. But the house stood unchanged, a relic from a darker time, its windows like watchful eyes. Travelers came in groups, carrying candles and daring one another to descend into the cellar. Some swore they heard nothing. Others left shaking, their faces pale as the twins themselves. And then, the deaths began again. The first was a young man named Elias Cobb, a local journalist who made his reputation mocking superstition. He bragged in the Providence Journal that he would sleep in the Rutherford cellar and prove once and for all that the voices were just the wind through the stones. The next morning, townspeople found him lying at the bottom of the cellar stairs. No wounds, no sign of a fall, but his face, frozen in an expression of such terror that even the coroner refused to write a full report. The death was ruled apoplexy due to fright. 2 years later, a wealthy Boston family bought the house at auction, intending to renovate it into a summer retreat. They lasted 12 days. On the 11th night, the servants fled without their wages, claiming they'd seen children sitting at the end of their beds in the dark, singing in perfect unison. The family left the next morning and never spoke of what happened in it. But their foreman, a man named Isaac Burr, told neighbors what he saw when he went into the cellar to shut off the lamps one last time. 2 small beds had been dragged into the center of the floor, the dirt was freshly turned, and on the wall, scratched deep enough to gouge the stone, were 3 words: "Not yet finished." When Burr tried to show others the markings the next day, they were gone. But every workman who had been on the job refused to return, and every one of them reported the same thing for weeks afterward. When they lay down to sleep, they could still hear singing, soft, right under the floorboards. By 1903, the Rutherford house was abandoned, its shutters permanently closed, its roof sagging like an old man's spine. But that only made it more tempting. The industrial age had brought a hunger for the strange. Seances, spirit photography, occult lodges sprouting in cities like weeds. Providence was no different. Members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a secretive, esoteric society, came to Benefit Street one moonless night and broke into the house. Their leader, a man named Dr. Horace Wilkins, believed the cellar was not cursed, but consecrated. He claimed Ezra Rutherford had stumbled onto something ancient, not madness, not murder. A gateway. Wilkins kept careful notes of their rituals in that basement. The first night, the group reported nothing more than a feeling of being watched, but on the third night the temperature dropped so low that their breath turned to mist, though it was the middle of June. On the seventh night, one member left screaming, saying he had seen two children kneeling in the corner, their faces lit from below as though by invisible lamps. The group pressed on. On the ninth night they attempted what Wilkins called the completion rite, an effort to open the gate that Ezra had begun. It ended in disaster. Jachbers heard chanting from beneath the house, then a sound like a cannon blast. When police arrived, the cellar was filled with smoke and the smell of burning tallow. 4 of the participants were dead, their faces peaceful, as though they had died in prayer. Wilkins survived, but his mind never returned. He was found kneeling in the dirt, whispering the same phrase over and over. They have no eyes. They have no need of light. He was committed to the Butler Hospital for the Insane, where he died 5 years later, still muttering about the children who sing in the dark. After that night, the city boarded up the Rutherford house for good, nailing the cellar door shut with iron spikes and warning trespassers away. But you can only keep the curious out for so long. By the 1920s, the house had become a proving ground for fraternity hazing, for late-night dares, for young men who wanted to test their courage. And not all of them came back. The most famous of those disappearances happened in 1927. His name was Thomas Beach, a Brown University student known for his arrogance and love of attention. It was the night of his fraternity initiation when he and 3 pledges snuck out of their dormitory and made their way to Benefit Street. They carried candles and a single crowbar. The key to becoming full members was simple. Descend into the Rutherford basement, spend 1 hour in total darkness, and return with a piece of stone from the cellar wall. The others swore later that Thomas was fearless when they pried open the door. Laughing, he went first down the steps, waving his candle like a torch. But when he reached the bottom, something changed. He called up to the others, his voice tight, saying the air was thicker down there, like he was breathing through wet cloth. Still laughing nervously, he walked deeper into the chamber. Then his candle went out. The others waited. First 5 minutes, then 10. Then they heard it. Faint, childlike singing. At first they thought Thomas was playing a trick. Until the voices multiplied. Soft, perfectly in sync, surrounding the boys though they still stood at the top of the stairs. And then Thomas screamed. The kind of scream no one fakes. One of the pledges tried to run down after him but was yanked back by the others, who bolted from the house, leaving Thomas behind. When police searched the basement the next morning, they found no body. But in the dirt near the center of the room, someone had drawn 2 small handprints, side by side, and written, in perfect script, a single phrase: "He stays." Thomas Beach was never seen again. His fraternity brothers were expelled for trespassing, but none of them would ever speak publicly about what they'd heard that night. Years later, one of them confessed on his deathbed that sometimes, when the house was quiet and his own children were asleep, he could still hear that singing just beneath the floorboards. By the 1940s, the Rutherford house had been abandoned for decades. The shingles curled like claws. The windows gaped, black and hollow. Vines crept across the walls like veins on a corpse. But the legend, the singing, refused to fade. Soldiers on leave from the nearby naval base would dare each other to spend a night inside before shipping out. Most returned shaken but alive, laughing it off over whiskey. But a few did not. In 1943, 2 sailors were found in the cellar, sitting upright against the far wall. Their candles had burned all the way down to nothing. Both men were dead. No wounds, no signs of violence. Their faces were wet, as though they'd been crying. One of them had carved a single word into the dirt between his boots. Listen. The deaths were quietly hushed by the Navy, and the house was once again sealed, this time with steel bars across the cellar door. But you can't stop a story once it starts breathing on its own. Through the 1950s and 60s, kiddies whispered about it under streetlights. They dared one another to run up the porch steps and touch the door, to press their ears against the wood and hear if the voices were still there. And they were. One boy swore he heard someone whisper his own name. Another said he heard 2 children singing. And one of them stopped, mid-song, as if noticing him, before humming softly right against the door until he ran screaming into the night. Even adults avoided the house after dark. Delivery men crossed the street rather than pass it. Priests from St. John's claimed they felt a weight whenever they walked past. By the 1970s, the house had become the centerpiece of every Providence ghost tour, a dark jewel of the city's haunted history. But there were rumors, too, that the house wasn't done, that every few decades someone disappeared, someone was claimed, and that Ezra Rutherford's descendants still lived quietly in Rhode Island, always watching, always listening, waiting. By the early 2000s, the Rutherford house was no longer just a local ghost story. It was an obsession. Urban explorers with cheap camcorders and grainy night vision filters broke through the cellar door, determined to be the first to capture proof. Most of their footage was what you'd expect. Creaking floorboards, dust swirling in the beam of a flashlight, nervous laughter. But one tape changed everything. In 2004, a group of 3 college students spent the night in the house with digital recorders running. 2 hours into their footage, nothing happened. Then, faintly, almost too faint to notice, the sound of children singing. At first it was so soft that viewers thought it was just a trick of the wind. But then the pitch rose, high, then higher, then stopping so abruptly that the silence was worse than the sound. One of the students, a girl named Lena, whispered on tape, "Did you hear that? It sounded like it was behind me." The camera swung wildly, and for a single frame, something moved in the corner. 2 shapes. Small, still. When the students ran screaming from the house, the camera kept rolling, bouncing as it hit the dirt outside. The tape ends with a single chilling sound. Not screaming, not singing. Laughter. Soft, childlike, close enough to the microphone that it felt like it was inside the camera itself. The footage leaked online within weeks, shared across early message boards and ghost forums, debated frame by frame. Skeptics called it fake, but those who believed swore it was the most authentic paranormal evidence ever captured. Lena refused to give interviews, but 5 years later she disappeared. Her car was found parked just 2 blocks from Benefit Street. The driver's seat was empty, the door unlocked, and in the passenger seat, carefully placed, was the original camera from 2004. Its battery was dead, but when investigators replayed the tape there was new footage, a single 5-second clip, the camera staring at the cellar door, and the sound of children singing softly, as if to welcome someone home. The 2004 tape was just the beginning. By 2010, the Rutherford house had become one of the most infamous locations in paranormal investigation circles. Ghost hunting TV shows filmed entire episodes inside, their night vision cameras glowing green as they crept through the rooms. What they captured only deepened the mystery. One episode showed a thermal camera detecting 2 heat signatures standing side by side in the corner of the cellar, even though the room was empty. Another caught the sound of faint humming on an EVP recorder, followed by a man's whisper, barely audible. "Don't let them finish." But skeptics were just as fascinated. Harvard and MIT researchers brought electromagnetic sensors, microphones, even seismic equipment determined to prove the sounds were natural. Air moving through the foundation, vibrations from passing trucks. What they recorded stunned them. The singing didn't match any natural frequency nor any known human voice pattern. In fact, it was layered, as if multiple voices were singing at once, harmonizing perfectly. But the strangest discovery came when they mapped the sound waves. The voices weren't coming from the walls, they were coming from beneath the cellar, as though there was another chamber deeper underground, one no one had ever discovered. That revelation turned the house from a curiosity into an obsession. A private team funded by a wealthy Rhode Island historian began a small excavation in 2012. On the third day, they uncovered something no one expected. A trapdoor, buried under 2 feet of packed dirt. When they pried it open, a rush of cold air escaped, strong enough to snuff out their lanterns. One worker swore he heard giggling. The team refused to go any deeper. They sealed the door again and left the house that same night, never to return. But word of the discovery leaked, and it only fed the legend. The idea that there was something hidden below the cellar, something even darker, became the new focus of every ghost hunter, historian, and thrill seeker in America. And as the world's attention turned back to Benefit Street, strange things began happening to those who dared to go there. Car batteries dying in the driveway, phones recording faint lullabies in the middle of the night, visitors waking up with dirt under their fingernails. The first to pay the price was the excavation team's foreman, a man named Gerald Pike. Just weeks after leaving the Rutherford house, Pike began complaining that he couldn't sleep. Not because he wasn't tired, but because every time he drifted off he heard it. Soft, perfect singing, always the same 2 voices, always just beneath him, as though they were lying under the floorboards. Within a month, Pike was living out of his truck, afraid to enter any building with a basement. His wife found him one morning parked outside the old house, staring at the boarded cellar door. When she asked what he was doing, he just said, "They want me to finish it." 3 days later, he vanished. His truck was discovered abandoned, keys still in the ignition. In the bed of the truck was a single object, a child's shoe, half buried in fresh dirt. And Pike wasn't the only one. A cameraman from a popular ghost hunting show claimed that after filming inside the house, his infant daughter woke up every night at 3:12 a.m., singing a song no one had taught her. A graduate student who studied the audio recordings became obsessed with them, slowing them down, layering them, looking for hidden meaning. On the night of his disappearance, he called a colleague and whispered, terrified, that he had figured it out. "It's not a song. It's a ritual." He hung up before he could explain more. Police found his apartment in disarray, every wall covered in sheet music he'd drawn by hand. The last page contained a single line of music, unfinished, followed by 2 words written over and over until the ink tore the paper. "Help them." Every investigator who went into the house seemed to come back changed. Some went silent and refused to speak about what they saw. Others couldn't stop talking, until their friends started to notice things happening around them. Lights flickering when they entered a room, children in the neighborhood humming songs they had never heard before, and always the feeling that they were being followed, not by something hostile, but by something patient, something waiting for the right moment. By the late 2010s, the Rutherford house had found a new audience. Not ghost tours, not historians, but live streamers. Dozens of thrill seekers began broadcasting themselves, breaking into the house in real time, their viewers egging them on in the comments. At first it was just cheap scares, shadows that turned out to be rats, strange noises that turned out to be creaking wood. But then came the stream that no one ever forgot. It was a rainy night in October 2019 when a popular paranormal TikToker named Kayla J went live from the cellar. More than 40,000 people watched as she and her friend laughed nervously, shining their phones into the dirt floor, joking about finding the ghost kids. 20 minutes in, the laughter stopped. Kayla froze, her camera pointed at the far corner. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Through the static, faintly came the sound of singing. At first, the chat thought it was fake, but the melody grew clearer, closer, until the two voices were unmistakable. Children, harmonizing perfectly. Kayla's friend whispered, "They're right behind us." The phone turned, fast, catching something pale just at the edge of the frame. Two small figures, standing, watching, and then the stream cut out. No warning, no disconnect message, just black. When police entered the house the next morning, the cellar was empty. Kayla's phone was found lying in the dirt, screen cracked, still recording. The final frame, a close-up of the cellar wall, and scrawled in the dirt with what looked like a finger, "Almost done." Kayla and her friend were never found. The clip went viral, not just because of what it showed, but because of what viewers claimed afterward. Thousands of people swore that when they re-watched the video, they could hear something whisper their name. Some said the singing followed them, in dreams, in the sound of running water, in the hum of their refrigerators at night. TikTok eventually took the clip down, citing disturbing content. But by then, it had already been mirrored across the internet. The house had gone from a local legend to a global curse. And people around the world were daring each other to go listen for the voices themselves. In the years since Kayla's stream, the Rutherford house has become something more than a haunted location. It feels awake. Neighbors on benefit. Street reports strange lights flickering under the floorboards at night, as though lanterns are burning deep beneath the earth. Some swear they've heard singing drifting through the street, faint enough to question their sanity, but clear enough to make their skin crawl. And then the disappearances began again. Not thrill-seekers this time. Neighbors, delivery drivers, a young couple walking home from dinner, all last seen within a block of the house. Their phones later found on the steps, cameras open, recording darkness, and the faint sound of children laughing. City officials have tried everything: steel bars, concrete barricades, even filling the cellar with gravel. But no matter what they do, within weeks, the house seems to undo it. The bars are found twisted open, the gravel swept aside as though by careful hands, and the singing returns louder than before. Some researchers believe the voices are growing stronger, that whatever Ezra Rutherford began nearly 2 centuries ago is reaching its conclusion. One modern folklorist, Dr. Elaine Harrow, puts it bluntly: the singing isn't a haunting, it's a countdown. She believes Ezra was trying to summon something, not save his children, but offer them as part of a bargain, and that bargain is nearly complete. Dr. Harrow points to the words left behind: not yet finished. The children's song looping endlessly, the ritual music the graduate student found in the recordings. Put together, she says, it forms a pattern, one that stops just before the final notes, and when the last note is sung, she warns, it may not just be the house that changes. Whatever is waiting in that cellar, whatever has been waiting for almost 200 years, might finally step through. And the singing may no longer be confined to Benefit Street. It may spread everywhere. In 2023, Dr. Elaine Harrow made the decision that would define her career and possibly end her life. She announced in a podcast interview that she intended to enter the Rutherford cellar herself, armed with state-of-the-art recording equipment, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of 3 trusted researchers. Her plan was simple: document every sound, map every inch of the basement, and so, if possible, locate whatever chamber lay beneath the dirt floor. On the night of the investigation, a small crowd gathered on Benefit Street to watch. Live streamers set up cameras across the street, hoping to capture history. At 11:30 p.m., Dr. Harrow and her team forced open the cellar door and descended into the dark. What happened over the next 90 minutes is still debated by paranormal investigators to this day. The first half hour was calm. The team joked nervously, took soil samples, set up their radar. Then, the singing began. Soft at first, just 2 voices perfectly in tune. Dr. Harrow's microphone picked it up clearly. "Are you hearing this?" she asked the others. "It's coming from below us," one of them replied, voice shaking. At 12:07 a.m., the radar detected a hollow space beneath the cellar floor, a circular chamber about 12 feet across. They marked the spot and began digging. The singing grew louder. At 12:19 a.m., the live stream's viewers reported something terrifying. Faint childlike laughter, Not from inside the cellar, but from their own speakers, as though the sound was bleeding through the feed itself. Then, suddenly, the stream cut out. The next morning the house was empty. Dr. Harrow's cameras were found scattered across the floor, still recording, but the footage was warped, corrupted. The only clear image was the final frame from the last camera, a hole, freshly dug, opening into blackness, and 2 sets of small, bare footprints leading away from it. The city sealed the house once again, but not before Harrow's surviving graduate assistant gave a statement to reporters. He refused to go on camera. He refused to enter any building with a basement. But his words were burned into everyone who heard them. It wasn't us digging toward them. It was them digging toward us. By sunrise, Providence was alive with whispers. The local authorities claimed they had secured the Rutherford property, but residents reported unusual phenomena within hours. Windows rattled despite calm winds, doors that had been locked from the outside creaked open, and from beneath the house, faint, harmonious cries carried across the street. Journalists were barred from entering, investigators were denied access, even members of the Historical Society were told, in no uncertain terms, that they were not to disturb the property. The reason, as some whispered, was simple. They had opened a space that was never meant to be opened. Inside, something had shifted. The cellar, once dormant, was now active. Dr. Harrow's radar had detected anomalies even days later, energy readings that defied known physics, pulsing in rhythms almost identical to the human heartbeat, but multiple, overlapping, and unnatural. Experts who reviewed the footage reported that the singing voices, now captured as audio spectrograms, contained frequencies beyond the range of normal human hearing. Some could feel it in their chest, a vibration that made their rib cages hum. The city, terrified of public panic, quietly requested military-grade surveillance. Drones hovered over the house day and night, but no one could explain the sudden disappearance of shadows captured on infrared cameras. Neighbors began leaving. Families who had lived near Benefit Street for generations packed up in the middle of the night. One witness, a retired seamstress, described seeing 2 figures at the window, barely human, pale and unmoving, staring down at the street for hours, their eyes reflecting no light. Calls to the authorities produced no response beyond a calm voice, saying, "Do not interfere, do not look, do not acknowledge." Even the local clergy, who had long told tales of Ezra Rutherford as a cautionary story, refused to speak of the house anymore. The Rutherford cellar had become more than a crime scene, more than a curiosity. It had become a warning, and in the years that followed, reports emerged, sporadic but undeniable. A child's laughter in an empty room, shadowed figures in basements, residents claiming in hushed tones that the children of the Rutherford house were still alive, but not in any way a normal human could be. Some said they moved beneath the city itself through tunnels no map had ever recorded, and some wondered, quietly, fearfully, if anyone who entered the basement uninvited would ever return, fully human. Ezra Rutherford's journals, long sealed away, reveal a mind unraveling beneath the weight of faith and obsession. He wrote not of cruelty, but of duty, not of punishment, but of preservation. In his mind, the world above was poison. Every laugh, every touch, every glance, every word a corrupting agent against the purity he had been chosen to protect. The twins were not children to him. They were vessels, living, breathing vessels meant to contain innocence as though it were a sacred artifact. By mid-1763, he had completed what he called the preservation plan. Every day was regimented. Meals were symbolic, prayers were meticulously timed, and the children's exposure to light was controlled with precision, measured in hours and minutes. Ezra's obsession extended to their very senses. Their eyes were shielded from sunlight, yet taught to read scripture in the faint glow of carefully angled lamps. Their ears, trained to hymns, absorbed only the tones he deemed spiritually pure, and yet isolation breeds unnatural awareness. Samuel and Judith began to respond to one another in ways beyond normal sibling intuition. Movements synchronized perfectly, voices echoed across the basement with harmonic resonance, almost as if they were one being in 2 forms. Visitors, if they ever glimpsed them through the tiny upper windows, claimed the children's gazes penetrated beyond the flesh, as though looking directly into one's soul. Ezra documented everything, every reaction, every syllable of the children's speech, every minute shift in their physical and emotional state became data. He believed that through careful observation, he could not only preserve innocence but perfect it. And yet, even he could not anticipate the side effects. The children began to change, not just in body or mind, but in essence. The journals describe moments of silence that lasted hours, where it seemed the twins were communicating telepathically. No human could have understood the words spoken between them, yet Ezra recorded them, desperately trying to decipher divine logic in what might have been madness. Mercy, at first compliant, began to falter. Isolation weighed on her. She saw shadows move where none should exist, heard whispers behind locked doors, and felt the subtle pressure of eyes that never blinked. Yet Ezra's will was absolute. Every argument, every plea from Mercy was countered with scripture and logic so twisted it was impossible to refuse. God has given us this charge. To falter is to sin. To question is to corrupt. Oh, Tim, you said it's in. And so the basement became a temple and a prison. Neighbors whispered of the sounds at night, children singing hymns with a resonance so unnatural it froze listeners in their doorways. Some who tried to intervene fell sick. Others fled, muttering about the touch of the house as though it marked them. No one could deny it. Something unnatural was growing beneath the Rutherford home, something Ezra called holy, something the world would never comprehend. By the winter of 1763, the basement had transformed completely. What was once a sanctuary of faith had become a labyrinth of ritual, control, and obsession. Ezra walked its stone floors like a general inspecting an army. Only his soldiers were infants, fragile yet meticulously molded by his will. The twins, Samuel and Judith, were no longer merely children. They had become extensions of his mind, mirrors of his fears, vessels of his devotion. Their eyes, pale and luminous in the oil lamplight, seemed to see both the walls around them and the world beyond, as if the basement had altered not just their bodies, but their very perception. Ezra recorded every movement, every sound, every whispered syllable. Every emotion was catalogued, every glance a moral test, every cry a warning. And then the first visitors arrived, distant relatives, drawn by curiosity, unaware of the depth of Ezra's obsession. Mercy had reluctantly convinced herself that the twins could safely meet others briefly. The family's cousins descended the staircase, their steps tentative, unaware of the oppressive atmosphere. The moment they entered the basement, the air seemed to thicken. Lamps flickered unnaturally, casting shadows that moved independently of the flames. A silence unlike anything Providence had ever known fell over the room, so dense it pressed against the chest, suffocating, unrelenting. And then came the singing. The twins' voices, melodic yet discordant, rose in unison. They were hymns, yes, but interwoven with notes and rhythms that no human ear should be able to produce. The cousins froze, transfixed, their faces pale. The sound carried something beyond melody, a weight, a presence, a force that pressed into the very marrow of their bones. Ezra smiled, a thin, unnatural smile. This was proof of his plan, purity preserved, innocence perfected. But what he did not anticipate was the effect on the visitors. One cousin stumbled backward, clutching her chest, tears streaming. Another whispered that she could feel small hands gripping her ankles as if the children themselves were reaching beyond the basement. Mercy realized then the truth that had been growing in her mind for months. The basement was no longer merely a sanctuary. It had become something unnatural, something alive, something that demanded obedience and devotion not from the children but from everyone who entered. Ezra, sensing her fear, dismissed it with scripture. Yet the journals reveal that even he felt the first pricklings of unease. A recognition that the basement's sanctity was evolving in ways he could not fully control. By the time the cousins fled the house, the singing had stopped. Only the echoes remained, lingering in the stone walls, as though the basement had swallowed part of their souls. From that moment, Providence whispered about the Rutherfords in hushed tones, children's voices under floors, shadows in windows that shouldn't exist, a house alive with the weight of obsession and devotion, and a father whose God-given purpose had crossed into a horror that no prayer could undo. By the spring of 1764, Samuel and Judith had begun to change in ways that even Ezra could not have fully anticipated. They were no longer simply children raised in isolation. Their movements, synchronized to an almost supernatural degree, hinted at a consciousness beyond their age. When one turned, the other mirrored perfectly, as though their bodies shared a single mind. The basement, which Ezra had meticulously designed for spiritual preservation, had become a vessel for something else, something that fed on devotion, obedience, and fear. Shadows seemed to linger longer than light, and the faintest whisper of air carried the scent of oil lamps mixed with something older, something primal. Ezra believed he was witnessing the perfection of innocence. But Mercy began to notice subtle anomalies. The twins' eyes, once simply pale and wide, now glowed faintly in the dim light. Their voices, when they sang hymns, produced harmonics that no adult could replicate, overtones that pressed into the listener's mind, evoking awe, fear, and a kind of trembling recognition that there was something deeply wrong. One evening, as Ezra conducted his nightly prayers, he paused mid-verse. Samuel's head tilted slightly, listening, and Judith followed instantly. A low, guttural sound emanated from the stone walls, unaccounted for by any earthly source. Ezra dismissed it as the settling of the house. Mercy, however, recoiled. She had begun to understand that the basement itself seemed alive, responsive, aware, demanding. It was not just a room, it was a crucible. Ezra, consumed by his mission, began to push further. He introduced rituals designed to strengthen the twins' spiritual fortitude, long periods of silence, exercises in memorization of scripture, prayers repeated until voices cracked. He tested them as he once tested the town. Careful observation, cataloging, recording. But now, the subjects of his study were his own flesh and blood, and the twins responded. Samuel, at 4 years old, began to hum complex melodies that Ezra had never taught him. Judith, in turn, would finish the last notes with an uncanny precision. When placed in separate chambers, they cried in tandem, their distress a harmonic echo that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. Ezra interpreted this as divine confirmation, proof that his plan for purity had worked. Mercy interpreted it as horror. The first major incident occurred when a neighbor's child wandered near the Rutherfords' property. Samuel's cry rang out, startling the visitor, but Judith's response was different. Her voice carried over the stone walls, calling in a tone that was neither friendly nor neutral, but commanding. The neighbor fled. The twins had begun to communicate, not with words, but with an authority and presence that unsettled every adult who approached. It was in these moments that Mercy realized something undeniable. The basement had become a chamber of transformation, and Ezra, blinded by his conviction, could not see that he had crossed from devotion into obsession. The house had taken on a life of its own, feeding not on evil, but on the intensity of his faith, shaping the twins into something that Providence had never witnessed before, and perhaps should never have. By mid-1764, whispers had begun to circulate through Providence, not the polite rumors of social gatherings or the idle gossip of the marketplace, but the kind of murmurs that curdled the blood, reports of children who should have been ordinary, yet were anything but. Families who passed near the Rutherford house spoke of faint cries that rose at sunset, harmonized like a choir, yet carrying undertones that made grown men cross themselves. The first direct witness was a baker, Mr. Hawkins, who had delivered bread to the Rutherfords for decades. On a late afternoon in May, he claimed to hear the twins' voices before he reached the front door. He hesitated, feeling a strange pressure at his chest, an almost magnetic pull toward the basement windows. Then the voices stopped. Hawkins rushed home, insisting that something unnatural dwelled beneath Ezra's house. The story spread through Providence like wildfire, met with nervous laughter in public, but hushed dread in private. Neighbors noticed other anomalies. Small objects moved without explanation. Doors that should have been latched swung open, only to close again as if by invisible hands. At night, shadows flickered in ways that defied candlelight, and always there were the cries, faint, mournful, yet hypnotically melodic. They spoke of a presence, not of children, but something else entirely, something that had grown within the stone walls. Ezra, meanwhile, was oblivious to the mounting fear outside. His world had contracted to the basement, the stone sanctuary he had built for preservation. He conducted lessons in moral rigor and spiritual endurance for Samuel and Judith, interpreting every abnormality as proof that his methods were divinely sanctioned. Each cry, each strange vibration of sound, he convinced himself, was the voice of God confirming the righteousness of his plan. Mercy, however, was beginning to falter. She had observed changes that Ezra could not. Samuel's eyes occasionally glowed in the half-light, and Judith's presence seemed to bend the air, creating small disturbances in candle flames and dust motes. The twins' laughter was no longer innocent. It carried a resonance that lingered long after the sound faded, like a chord struck in some deep, secret place. Mercy whispered her fears to no one. Even her closest friends did not dare speak the names of children possessed by shadows. Then came the night that would forever mark Providence. A young boy, sent by his father to deliver a message, trespassed near the basement window. He claimed the twins' eyes pierced him through the stone, and when he fled, he swore he felt fingers brush his ankles, cold and insistent. By morning, the town had heard his tale, and the fear escalated to paranoia. Families kept children indoors, shopkeepers bolted doors early, and the Rutherfords' house became a silent, looming edifice of dread. The stage was set. Providence was no longer merely a colonial town, it had become a town haunted by innocence gone dark. And within the walls of the Rutherford basement, Ezra's plan had reached a critical juncture. The twins were no longer children in the ordinary sense. They were something beyond, something that blurred the lines between light and shadow, between obedience and something far darker. The question now was no longer whether the town would notice, but whether anyone could survive the truth once it emerged from the basement. By the summer of 1764, Ezra's devotion to his twisted vision had crossed a line that Mercy could no longer ignore. The basement, once a sanctuary in his eyes, had become a prison, not merely for the twins, but for every fragment of humanity that lingered in that space. Samuel and Judith, now approaching their second year, had never felt sunlight on their skin, nor wind against their cheeks. Their eyes, pale as parchment and unnaturally reflective, had adjusted to the dim lamplight, recording every shadow, every movement, as if the basement were the entire universe. Mercy tried to reason with Ezra. She pleaded, whispering in candlelight that the children were more than vessels for his righteousness. They were human, fragile beings who needed the world, needed warmth, needed life. But Ezra's responses were methodical, unwavering. The world poisons before it teaches. They are not yet ready, he insisted, his eyes sharp as flint, and it is my duty to guard their purity, whatever the cost. The rituals in the basement grew more structured, more deliberate. Ezra had begun marking time with hymns, prayers, and schedules, as if the twins' very lives could be calibrated like a spiritual experiment. He read scripture aloud, then paused, measuring their reactions to the cadence of his voice. He documented their responses meticulously in journals hidden beneath floorboards, chronicling not only physical growth but moral susceptibility. A ledger of innocence tested and preserved. Mercy's fears became visceral. She noticed small bruises on the children, faint patterns on their skin that appeared after nights alone with Ezra. The twins' laughter, once musical, now carried a sharp, hollow resonance that made her stomach twist. She began to see them as shadows of themselves, alive, yes, but warped in ways she could not yet name. At times they would stop mid-play and stare at the walls as if hearing voices from the stone itself. The air around them seemed thick with intent, charged with an unseen force that Ezra alone appeared able to navigate. Outside the basement, Providence felt the tension without knowing why. The city's elite whispered of a darkness emanating from the Rutherford home. Travelers passing the street reported chills, faint chanting, and the echo of infant cries that made even hardened sailors quicken their pace. Every night, Ezra's activities above ground became more secretive. He would visit ships docked at the harbor, exchange cryptic notes with unknown men, and return after hours, drenched in sweat and muttering to himself in languages Mercy could not understand. Mercy's despair deepened when she realized that Ezra had begun teaching the twins to respond not just to scripture, but to ritual commands. Simple cues, a flicker of candlelight, a word spoken in low tones, elicited obedience. The children, even now, seemed to bend instinctively, their will co-opted before it had fully formed. It was a control she could not fathom, and she could not stop. The basement was no longer just a place of preservation. It had become a crucible, a forge where innocence was reshaped into something unnatural, something designed to obey a father's terrifying vision of divine order. And Mercy knew with a fear that stole her breath that once the twins had fully adapted to this world below ground, there would be no return. Providence itself teetered unknowingly at the edge of revelation. Soon, the city would discover that the darkness behind the Rutherfords' walls was not merely spiritual corruption. It was a calculated, deliberate horror. And the twins, trapped in a world of shadows and lamplight, would be at the center of it. By late 1764, whispers in Providence had begun to take form. Neighbors reported strange noises emanating from the Rutherford home. Soft crying that morphed into chanting. Footsteps echoing across empty halls, and sometimes the faintest giggle that sounded entirely too knowing for children so young. But those who dared approach the house described a sense of weight, of being watched, of the air itself thickening as if alive. Most hurried past, clutching their cloaks tightly and avoiding eye contact with the towering windows of Ezra's mansion. Inside the basement, Ezra's methods had become ritualized to the point of obsession. He had introduced exercises that required the twins to memorize scripture with a precision that bordered on mechanical. Mispronunciations were corrected with sharp, quiet admonishments. At night he would sit in the dim glow of oil lamps and whisper prayers into their ears, a litany of warnings against worldly corruption. Mercy observed this from the shadows, her heart aching, but she dared not intervene. Every attempt to question Ezra was met with a piercing stare that silenced even the faintest whisper of defiance. The twins themselves had begun to change in ways that were unsettlingly precise. Samuel's gaze could fix on a single point for what seemed like hours, his small hands clenched as if holding invisible threads. Judith, once gentle and pliable, had developed a quiet intensity and almost supernatural focus that made Mercy flinch. They responded instantly to Ezra's commands, yet even in his absence they moved with an awareness that no ordinary child should possess. Listening for sounds imperceptible, noting every shadow, every shift in temperature, every pattern of light flickering against stone walls. It was during one of these nights, when the wind howled against the Benefit Street windows and the lamps cast long, trembling shadows, that Mercy finally understood the full scope of Ezra's ambition. He wasn't preserving innocence, he was sculpting it, shaping human consciousness into a reflection of his vision of divine purity. The basement was no longer merely a nursery, it had become a laboratory of the soul, and Samuel and Judith were his first subjects. Outside, Providence had begun to take note in ways that Ezra could not fully conceal. A townsperson, brave or foolish enough, peered through a window and claimed to see children reciting hymns in voices that seemed far too mature for their age. Another heard faint sobbing, punctuated by the rhythmic intonation of prayer. And yet when anyone attempted to confront Ezra or even mention these oddities in polite society, he smiled, gracious and imposing, with a calm assurance that silenced suspicion. Mercy, trapped between fear and resignation, began to realize that the basement's shadow extended far beyond its stone walls. Providence itself was becoming a witness to a slow, deliberate corruption of the natural order. A manipulation so profound it would leave its mark on the city long after Ezra's own death. And the twins, once innocent and untainted, were already transformed. the first human subjects in a plan that was as horrifying as it was meticulous. The question Mercy could not answer, and dared not speak aloud, was this: once the children had been fully molded by Ezra's vision, would there remain any trace of their humanity? By early 1765, the murmurs in Providence had grown louder. Townsfolk whispered of children singing hymns beneath the streets, of cries that no one could locate, of shadows moving where no human should be. Some claimed the Rutherfords' house exuded a chill that followed them even after they had crossed the street. The authorities, pressured by repeated complaints, sent a small delegation to investigate, men whose duty was law, yet whose courage faltered at the sight of the mansion looming against the grey winter sky. When they knocked, Ezra welcomed them with polite composure. His grey eyes, cold and precise, scanned each man, reading their intentions, measuring their fear. He spoke of family matters, of Mercy's fragile health, of the twins' delicate constitution, weaving a narrative so flawless that only the most suspicious could sense the unease beneath his words. Yet as the officials turned to leave, none could shake the feeling that something had been concealed, that the house itself was hiding a secret no polite conversation could uncover. The basement, however, told a different story entirely. The walls absorbed sound, the oil lamps cast a gentle glow, and yet within that sanctuary, Samuel and Judith moved with eerie synchrony. Their voices, once mere recitations of scripture, now carried a resonance that seemed beyond human. The twins responded to unseen cues, glanced toward corners where no one stood, and even in silence, emitted a presence that was unsettling, oppressive. Ezra observed all of it with an intensity bordering on reverence or madness. Mercy's heart, already fractured by months of isolation, trembled at the realization of what was happening. She watched her children's innocence warp into precision, discipline, and something darker, an awareness that was unnatural, a vigilance that should not belong to a child. At night, she heard their whispered prayers to no one, rituals repeated with mechanical devotion. And when she dared to question Ezra, he would pause, gaze upon her with the same piercing grey eyes that had once inspired awe, and speak softly, almost tenderly. "You do not yet see what Providence has chosen. I serve the divine plan, Mercy. It is beyond our comprehension, yet necessary." Outside, Providence began to sense the unnatural order beneath the Rutherfords' floorboards. Neighbors reported shadows flitting in windows, distant laughter in the dead of night, a faint odor of burning oil where no lamp burned. Curiosity turned to fear, and fear became superstition. Parents warned their children not to approach Benefit Street. Merchants whispered of curses, and even clergy murmured prayers for protection. Yet all the while, Ezra's influence extended, subtle, insidious. His sermons grew more compelling, wing the faithful to his side, while the city's moral fabric, he believed, frayed precisely as he intended, leaving only a sanctuary of control for the twins below. And the twins, for their part, began to show signs that defied explanation. Samuel's gaze could fix on distant points above ground, as if he could see through walls. Judith, once gentle, now spoke in tones that suggested knowledge far beyond her age, repeating phrases Ezra had never taught her, anticipating questions before they were asked. Mercy understood in horror. Her children were no longer merely preserved. They were evolving into something else, beings shaped entirely by Ezra's obsession, removed from sunlight, from humanity, from the world itself. Providence, unknowingly, had become a spectator to a living experiment, one that would ultimately reveal the terrifying extent to which faith, obsession, and isolation could warp the natural order. By the spring of 1765, the basement sanctuary had become a prison of inevitability. The twins' bodies, once soft and pliable, had adapted to the darkness. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected the faint glow of the oil lamps as if they no longer required sunlight. Their skin, pale as parchment, seemed almost translucent under the gentle illumination, veins faintly visible like maps of some hidden, uncharted world. Samuel moved with purpose. Judith with a careful, unnatural grace, and together they had developed a rhythm that was terrifying in its perfection, a rhythm dictated entirely by Ezra's obsessions. Mercy's mind, once a haven of gentleness and concern, began to fracture under the weight of isolation and the mounting horror of her own complicity. She spoke less and less, and when she did, her words were careful, almost rehearsed, as though even her thoughts were measured to avoid provoking Ezra. Nights became unbearable. The twins' whispered prayers, once simple hymns, now carried layers of meaning she could not comprehend. And beneath those prayers, Mercy began to hear a faint, repetitive sound, a scratching, almost imperceptible, coming from the walls themselves. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, yet the sensation of being watched never left her. Ezra, meanwhile, had grown bolder. He began recording observations in journals that Mercy dared not read. Each entry detailed the twins' development, their increasing capacity for mimicry, their startling responsiveness to commands he had never spoken aloud. He rationalized each step as divine necessity, the purification of innocence before the world could corrupt it. But his devotion had metastasized into something monstrous. His hands trembled slightly as he wrote, not with fear, but with the ecstasy of a man convinced he was molding eternity itself. The first signs of tragedy came subtly. Samuel's cry, once a call for nourishment or comfort, took on an eerie cadence, a pattern that caused the household dog to whimper and flee the basement. Judith's laughter, soft and melodic, began in the middle of the night, cutting through Mercy's restless sleep and echoing with a resonance she could not identify. It was in these hours that Mercy realized the children were no longer merely innocent. They had absorbed Ezra's convictions, his fear of corruption, and had internalized them to an unnatural degree. Their minds were developing along a path entirely dictated by him, a path that left no room for spontaneity, for joy, or for escape. Outside, Providence began to notice changes too. The air around the Rutherfords' house carried a subtle heaviness, a suffocating presence that made neighbors uneasy. Cats refused to cross the street. Children stopped playing near the mansion. Even the wind seemed to hesitate at the threshold, carrying whispers that no one could locate or understand. The authorities, increasingly unsettled, debated intervention. Yet whenever they approached Ezra's polis, his explanations, his commanding presence, and the veneer of devout respectability pushed them back, leaving only suspicion and unease. And so the basement became a world unto itself, a world of discipline, of ritual, of shadows and whispers, a world where Mercy, Samuel, and Judith existed in a suspended state, poised on the edge between devotion and horror. The very air in that stone chamber seemed to pulse with Ezra's will, a constant reminder that here, in the basement, he alone dictated reality. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, on a night thick with fog and the scent of damp stone. Ezra had retired to his private study above, leaving Mercy to tend to the twins. The oil lamps flickered, casting long, twitching shadows that seemed to merge with the walls. Samuel and Judith sat opposite each other on the small rug, their gazes locked in a silent communion that chilled Mercy to her core. She had watched them grow from helpless infants to creatures whose awareness of each other and of her was unnervingly deliberate. Then came the first real sign of change. Samuel reached for Judith's hand, and when she responded, it was not a playful gesture but a deliberate mimicry of something she had seen Ezra perform countless times. Their lips formed silent words she could not hear, their heads tilted at identical angles, as though rehearsed. Mercy realized with a dawning horror that the twins were no longer children. They were extensions of Ezra's will, vessels for his obsession with purity and control. That night, as she tried to whisper a lullaby, her voice seemed swallowed by the stone walls. The twins turned to her, unblinking, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force pressing her to the floor. Their eyes, mirrors of Ezra's own intensity, held a comprehension no infant should possess. Mercy felt herself faltering, a wave of nausea and despair rising as she realized the full scope of the basement's transformation. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crucible, one in which her children were being forged into something she could not name, something beyond innocence, beyond childhood. In the days that followed, Ezra's routines became more severe. He enforced strict schedules for prayer, reading, and physical exercises designed to instill discipline and spiritual fortitude. Mercy, now a silent observer and reluctant participant, watched as the twins responded with mechanical precision. Their tiny hands folded, their lips moved in unison, and even their breathing seemed synchronized. Any deviation was met with Ezra's piercing gaze, and the children, though only 3 years old, corrected themselves instantly. Mercy's heart broke with every measured movement, with every obedient smile. The basement air grew colder, heavier. The walls, once comforting, now seemed to close in, carrying echoes of chants and whispers that never originated from Mercy or the twins. Something unseen moved in the corners, brushing against the shadows with soft, deliberate motions. Mercy tried to speak, to plead, but no words came. The twins' connection with each other had grown so profound, so unnatural, that even she felt like an intruder in their shared consciousness. By the first week of April, Mercy knew the truth. The twins' minds were no longer theirs. They belonged to Ezra, molded by his fervor, his fear, and his obsession with a purity that could not coexist with the light of the world above. And in that moment, the basement was no longer simply a place of confinement. It was a testament to the horrifying extent of human conviction when twisted into obsession. Spring in Providence brought more than sunlight. It brought curiosity, suspicion, and the first serious cracks in Ezra's perfect facade. Whispers began circulating among neighbors about strange noises from the Rutherford house even before the official complaints reached city officials. Footsteps that weren't Mercy's, the faint murmur of twin voices singing in unrecognizable patterns, shadows flickering beneath curtained windows, all of it stoked fear in a city already attuned to superstition and religious fervor. Ezra, ever meticulous, had anticipated scrutiny. He moved with the practiced calm of a man whose mind operated on multiple layers. To the public he remained the devout Deacon Rutherford, eloquent in prayer, unwavering in moral authority. But beneath the surface, the basement was evolving into something even more sinister. Samuel and Judith had begun repeating words and phrases Ezra himself had never taught them, whispers of prayers and commands, uttered as if the walls themselves had imbued them with forbidden knowledge. Mercy could only shiver as she realized the twins were becoming conduits, vessels for a theology that no one outside the basement could understand. Neighbors began noticing patterns. Children who wandered too close to the property would stop abruptly, shivering, and return home mumbling lines that echoed the twins' hymns. Animals avoided the yard, refusing to enter, their coats bristling when Ezra stepped outside. By mid-April, Providence's authorities could no longer ignore the growing unease. A constable, initially dismissive, recounted tales of screams heard beneath the house and shadows moving in the windows after sunset. Ezra's response was both chilling and calculated. He welcomed the officials with serene hospitality, showing them nothing but the upper floors, his booming sermons of morality and purity now serving as camouflage for the monstrous reality below. He guided them past polished floors and carefully arranged furniture, presenting the perfect image of a man devoted to God and family. But the basement, the heart of his obsession, remained untouched, hidden behind heavy oak doors and locks only he could operate. Mercy's dread grew with each inspection, each polite inquiry from those who suspected something was wrong. She felt trapped, complicit by silence and exhaustion, unable to speak of what lay beneath. And the twins, Samuel and Judith, were no longer children in any sense the outside world could recognize. They moved in harmony with Ezra's shadowed intentions, their voices low and hypnotic, their tiny hands performing rituals of obedience that Mercy could only observe, powerless. By the end of April, whispers turned to official action. Authorities demanded entry, claiming they had received credible reports of danger to the children. Ezra, calm as ever, delayed them with promises of inspection at a later date, manipulating legal loopholes, church connections, and social influence. But Providence was closing in, and the walls that had once shielded innocence from corruption were now beginning to tremble under the weight of scrutiny. And so, the stage was set. The sanctuary Ezra had built with meticulous devotion was about to meet the intrusion of the outside world, a world whose laws, morality, and humanity threatened everything he had orchestrated below ground. The basement, once a haven, was now a trap ready to be exposed, and the twins were at the center of a horror that Providence would never forget. The day the authorities arrived, Providence seemed to hold its breath. A pale sun filtered through grey clouds, casting the streets in a muted light, as if the city itself sensed the confrontation to come. Ezra met the officials at the front door, calm, measured, the epitome of composure. His tall frame and commanding presence seemed almost to absorb the tension, projecting an aura of authority that left the constables uneasy. He spoke of propriety, of privacy, and of God's plan, assuring them there was no danger, no crime, nothing but the normal rhythms of a pious household. But the sounds, faint, melodic, eerie, drifted from below, carried upward by the stone walls, undeniable even through Ezra's careful barriers. The twins' voices, a haunting echo, sung in tones that seemed almost alien, vibrating with rhythms that unsettled the seasoned officers. Their syllables carried a resonance that left the men uneasy, their eyes darting toward the floor, toward the closed oak door that hid the basement's dark secret. One officer whispered of a chill, a weight pressing down from the house itself, and another muttered prayers under his breath, as if trying to shield his mind from the sounds beneath. Ezra, seeing the unease, allowed a superficial tour, showing the servants' quarters, the dining room, and the library. He narrated passages from scripture with impeccable precision, each word measured, deliberate, a distraction, a psychological shield. But no one saw the basement, not yet. And below, Samuel and Judith waited, their tiny forms illuminated by the oil lamps that cast steady, unmoving light. Their eyes, pale as parchment, reflected neither fear nor curiosity, only obedience. They knew nothing of the outside world, nothing of the sun or sky or city, only Ezra's teachings and the rhythms of the basement that had become their entire existence. The twins had developed rituals, subtle yet disturbing. Every movement was coordinated, every sound intentional, as if the basement itself dictated their behavior. They repeated prayers that no adult in Providence could recognize, phrases designed to invoke purity, obedience, and spiritual dominance. The air was heavy, thick with a scent of beeswax, old stone, and incense Ezra had begun experimenting with, substances meant to heighten the senses, bind the mind, and suppress rebellion. Mercy, standing silently beside Ezra, could barely breathe. She had seen the subtle changes, the unnatural focus in their eyes, the way their bodies moved as extensions of Ezra's will. She felt trapped, complicit, a witness to a horror she could neither prevent nor fully comprehend, and now, with Providence authorities knocking, her terror was about to collide with reality. Ezra finally spoke, his voice calm but commanding. He explained that the basement was a sanctuary, a place for study, prayer, and spiritual nurturing. He carefully omitted the truth, that it had become a crucible, forging the twins into vessels for a theology so extreme, so deviant, that it threatened the very moral fabric of Providence. The officers, unaware of what truly awaited, nodded politely, prepared to accept his assurances, unaware that the real horror lay just behind the locked oak door, where innocence had been meticulously stripped from the children, replaced with something alien, controlled, and terrifying. The confrontation had begun. Ezra's sanctuary, his perfect prison of devotion and darkness, was about to be breached. When the oak door finally gave way under the authorities' combined strength, a silence fell over the street outside, as if Providence itself recoiled. The sound of splintering wood echoed like a gunshot, but inside, the basement's darkness seemed to swallow the noise, absorbing it into the heavy stone walls. The air hit them first, thick, stagnant, and faintly sweet with the scent of beeswax, herbs, and something more subtle, something metallic, underlying, almost imperceptibly human. The officers hesitated, their torches trembling as they stepped into the chamber. What they saw defied reason. Oil lamps cast pools of steady light across the stone floors, illuminating a scene so meticulously arranged that it resembled a grotesque version of domestic perfection. Small beds aligned with mathematical precision, rugs and carpets immaculately placed, bookshelves filled with sacred texts that smelled of old paper and burning incense. And there, in the center of it all, the twins, Samuel and Judith, sat upright, their posture unnaturally perfect, their eyes wide, reflecting a pale, unearthly glow. They did not cry. They did not flinch. They did not acknowledge the officers at all. Their existence seemed tethered entirely to the basement's geometry, to Ezra's design. The first officer to speak did so in a whisper, his words barely audible over the oppressive silence. They're alive." Another shivered, pointing to the strange symbols carved into the walls, symbols that resembled no known religious script, but carried the weight of ritual, repetition, and control. Ezra stepped forward, serene, calm, the picture of a man who had orchestrated every detail of this encounter to project innocence, devotion, and righteousness. He claimed the children were, in the hands of God, nurtured away from the corruption above, growing in wisdom, purity, and faith beyond their years. But the journals, hidden in a small alcove, told a different story. Pages filled with theological justification, notes on behavioral conditioning, and instructions for preserving the light of God revealed a mind consumed by obsession. Ezra had meticulously documented the twins' every action, every sound, every moment of obedience, translating it into doctrine that no moral compass could reconcile. Mercy, silent and pale, recognized the truth in those pages. Her children had been transformed, their minds and bodies molded into instruments of an ideology so extreme it had erased their innocence entirely. Officers noted the unnatural stillness of the twins, their skin almost translucent, their senses sharpened beyond normal human capacity. They had never felt the sun, touched the grass, or tasted the wind. Their universe had been a basement and the iron will of their father. Every cry, every coo, every breath had been mediated, monitored, and manipulated. It was not just confinement, it was the creation of a new form of existence, one that blurred the line between life and ritualized spiritual servitude. Ezra, observing the reactions of the authorities, remained composed. His calm was chilling, his righteousness absolute. He understood the horror they felt, and he believed it to be misplaced. In his mind, he had saved them, preserved them, perfected them. Outside, Providence would label him a monster. But inside, in that quiet chamber of stone, he had achieved something far darker. The ultimate obedience of innocence, a testament to what a mind consumed by divine obsession could construct. The discovery would shock Providence for generations. The twins' eyes, unaccustomed to sunlight, squinted at the brightness above ground. But it was not the light that would haunt them. It was the memory of the basement, the voice of their father, the lessons of silence, ritual, and devotion that would follow them, forever shaping who they would never fully become. The city of Providence recoiled in horror when word of the Rutherford basement reached the wider public, though most details remained sealed for decades. Colonial authorities, fearful of the scandal and the theological implications, classified every journal, sketch, and testimony, locking them away in hidden archives. Publicly, the narrative was sanitized, a disturbed man, a tragic experiment gone awry, a cautionary tale for devout families. But those who had glimpsed the basement knew the truth, that Ezra Rutherford had constructed a cathedral of control beneath his home, a domain where innocence had been not protected but meticulously rewritten. Rumors spread like wildfire. Children in the streets whispered of the twins, of their unearthly eyes and unnatural calm. Neighbors swore they could still hear faint melodies at night, ghostly hymns that rose from the foundations of Benefit Street, carrying undertones that made even the bravest cross themselves. Families avoided the house, instinctively feeling that something lingered, something deliberate, something that could sense the smallest trespass. Each generation of occupants who dared remain longer than a month reported the essay. Eerie phenomena, footsteps where no one stood, shadows moving against the grain of light, small hands brushing at ankles in empty rooms. Historians and theologians would later debate Ezra's intentions, framing them as either pure madness or divine zeal gone unchecked, but the basement itself remained a testament to something more sinister, the architecture of psychological control perfected through isolation, ritual, and obsessive devotion. In every corner, every lamp, every carved symbol, the methodology was clear. Obedience could be manufactured, innocence could be engineered, and purity could be preserved, at a price that no human should bear. Even mercy, long after Ezra's death, carried the weight of that underground world. She spoke little, retreating into quiet corners of Providence, haunted not by the public scandal but by the knowledge of what had been wrought under her own roof. The twins, once removed from the basement, struggled to exist in sunlight. Their senses, adapted to perpetual shadow, recoiled at brightness. Their minds, trained for obedience and ritual, could barely navigate the chaos of normal life. Ezra had not just imprisoned their bodies, he had reconstructed their consciousness. And yet the city moved on, brushing the horror under layers of civility, commerce, and faith. The Rutherfords' home became a spectre in the collective memory of Providence. Children dared each other to approach the iron gate, to peek at windows where shadows seemed to move in deliberate choreography. Sailors arriving from the Caribbean whispered about Providence's haunted hill, claiming the harbor wind carried more than salt and fog. It carried a darkness rooted in human obsession, a moral contagion that could thrive for decades in silence. Those who studied Ezra's journals in later years noted something chilling. He wrote as if the basement were not just a physical space, but a psychological template. Every principle he applied, spatial control, sensory limitation, behavioral conditioning, could be replicated, adapted, perfected, and the most terrifying part, he believed it righteous, inevitable, and necessary. Providence had glimpsed a mind that could cage not just bodies, but souls. Halfway through this story, I want you to engage actively. Comment, "Light cannot touch twice below." This symbolic phrase locks in the awareness of what human obsession can create, and aligns your mind with the truths hidden beneath Providence, awakening the recognition that control can exist where you least suspect it. The basement of the Rutherford home did not die with Ezra. Its influence lingered, like a shadow stretching through the generations. Families that moved into the house reported subtle changes in behavior almost immediately. Children, previously healthy and spirited, began exhibiting heightened fears of the dark, as though some invisible eye watched them from beneath the floors. Sleep became fitful, nightmares common, and those who ventured near the basement felt a visceral chill, a weight pressing on their chest as if the very stones carried the memory of captivity. Psychologists studying the case centuries later described this as an early example of transgenerational trauma. The isolation, ritualized control, and extreme devotion to an imposed moral code had created echoes in the human psyche, a template for fear, obedience, and unease that did not require physical confinement to persist. Those who interacted with the twins, even for brief moments, reported feeling subtle unease that followed them for years. Samuel and Judith, raised in perpetual darkness, carried with them an almost spectral aura. They moved through society like fragments of a dream, distant, meticulous, always observing. People instinctively felt the weight of the basement in their presence, though none could articulate why. This was the unseen legacy of Ezra's work. The architecture of control had become contagious. It seeped into neighbors, merchants, and parishioners who had once admired him, leaving behind a generation acutely aware of sin, temptation, and divine punishment. Some historians argue that the events in the Rutherford basement contributed to the rigid moralism that gripped Providence society long after the 1760s. Fear of corruption became intertwined with piety, suspicion entwined with faith, and children grew up with the quiet understanding that even the most respected authority could harbor darkness beneath a carefully constructed veneer. Even as the city modernized, the stories persisted. Servants who had glimpsed the basement during renovations in the early 1800s reported hearing whispers in languages they did not recognize, sometimes chanting, sometimes pleading. Doors that were firmly closed would creak open on their own, and lamps placed on shelves would flicker as if acknowledging an unseen presence. Scholars now suggest that Ezra's journals, filled with precise notes on behavioral conditioning, may have laid the groundwork for later experiments in isolation and indoctrination, though none could admit this publicly without moral outrage. Providence itself became complicit in hiding the truth. The wealthier families, many descendants of merchants Ezra had once observed or influenced, carried forward a culture of secrecy and control. Their faith, once a guiding light, had become a mechanism for surveillance and regulation. The basement was gone, but its principles had spread outward, a virus of psychological manipulation, birthed in devotion, perfected in secrecy. By now, you should feel the full weight of what obedience and obsession can create. If you understand even a fraction of the control Ezra exercised, comment, "Light cannot touch," twice again. Reinforce the recognition that true power often hides beneath calm surfaces in the structures and routines of daily life, shaping generations silently, invisibly, inevitably. Samuel and Judith, once fragile infants bathed in flickering oil light, had grown into beings whose very existence seemed suspended between shadow and reality. The basement, their cradle of purity, had become their entire world. The sun, that life-giving force for all others, was a foreign presence, a burning, violent intrusion that seared their unaccustomed eyes. When first exposed above ground, even briefly, they recoiled violently, hissing at the brightness as though it were an enemy. Their skin, pale as parchment, shimmered unnaturally in the weak daylight, and their movements were deliberate, rehearsed, like actors performing a ritual that no one else fully understood. The townsfolk of Providence whispered. Some said the twins were cursed, unnatural, the product of godless sorcery disguised as devotion. Others spoke of their quiet intelligence, their ability to anticipate actions and words before they happened, as if the basement had not just protected them but sharpened them into something uncanny, almost otherworldly. Their father's journals, carefully preserved, guided them even after his death. Rituals, hymns, prayers, and behavioral patterns, all recorded in meticulous detail, became the invisible architecture of their lives. Samuel and Judith followed them with exacting precision, shaping their movements, their speech, their moral compass, all dictated by a man long gone, yet whose will lingered like smoke in the corners of their minds. By adolescence, they were strangers to the world above. Schools terrified them, the marketplace confused them, social gatherings, even those designed for children, became arenas of anxiety and dread. Samuel developed a habit of withdrawing into corners, silently observing, cataloguing each expression, each gesture of deceit, disobedience, or impurity. Judith, by contrast, became a spectral presence in the home, moving with deliberate care, a voice, a whisper, her eyes wide with perpetual wariness. Both carried the psychological imprint of their fathers. Obsession, a complex blend of genius, terror, and pathological control. Historians who have studied their lives suggest that the basement had not merely preserved innocence but fundamentally altered human development. The twins' senses, their moral reasoning, and even their perception of time were warped. They were capable of extraordinary focus, of feats of memory and learning that astounded Providence scholars, yet utterly incapable of forming normal relationships, empathy, or trust. The psychological price of their preserved purity was profound. Humanity itself had been reshaped into something alien, magnificent, and tragic. Visitors, few as they were, described the experience of encountering the twins as disorienting. Samuel's gaze could strip away pretense, expose hidden guilt, and provoke a visceral unease that lingered for days. Judith's presence, delicate yet commanding, seemed to warp the room around her, bending air, shadows, even thought, into quiet obedience. Providence learned to avoid them, learned to respect the invisible chains their father had forged, understanding instinctively that what had begun as devotion had mutated into a force that controlled, terrorized, and dominated even the living. The basement, though abandoned, remained the template of their lives. Every movement, every choice, every thought was informed by the lessons learned in that subterranean sanctuary. The twins' tragedy was not only in their isolation, but in the knowledge that they were both heirs and victims of a design that extended beyond one man. a design that would haunt Providence and any who dared enter the shadow of the Rutherford legacy forever. By the late 1770s, the Rutherford basement, once a sanctuary, had become a mausoleum of intent, a chamber of psychological engineering where the line between salvation and damnation no longer existed. Samuel and Judith, now in their late teens, were embodiments of their father's obsession, living relics of purity that no world above could ever touch without shattering. They moved through Providence like phantoms, their presence a quiet terror. Children whispered about them in the streets, merchants crossed to avoid their gaze, even the church pews felt haunted when they entered. Those who tried to confront or guide them were met with cold precision, a calculated awareness of weakness, temptation, and moral corruption that no ordinary human should possess. The final breaking point came one winter evening when an unscheduled inspection by city authorities, curious about rumors of the twins' continued confinement, forced the house open. What they discovered was almost impossible to comprehend. The basement was empty of visible inhabitants, yet the air itself seemed charged with expectancy, a tense stillness that spoke of control, ritual, and careful observation. In the journals left behind, Ezra Rutherford's meticulous instructions revealed the full scope of his plan. The twins had been trained to respond to spiritual, moral, and psychological cues. Their entire lives a series of guided interactions, carefully engineered to preserve purity, but at the cost of autonomy. Neighbors recalled that soon after the inspection, the twins disappeared. Some claimed they had simply vanished into the city, but Providence had changed them irreversibly. By the time any trace was recorded, Samuel and Judith were no longer human in the conventional sense. Their minds, shaped by darkness, isolation, and extreme discipline, had evolved into entities capable of bending those around them to their will. Testimonies from distant witnesses describe unsettling phenomena. Shadows that linger unnaturally, whispers that echo in empty rooms, and the sensation of unseen hands guiding the actions of the unwary. Some say that the twins themselves never left the basement, existing in some hidden, shadowed plane where Ezra's design